I'm Betsy Bowman, and I'm your host for today. Today's program is on the civil rights movement of the 1960s. We're pleased to have as our guest speakers our own Bob Stone and Cliff DuRand. Bob Stone and Cliff DuRand were the founders of the Radical Philosophy Association in 1982, a professional organization of philosophy professors, now celebrating its 40th anniversary. And they were co-founders with me of the Center for Global Justice in 2004. Bob Stone taught philosophy at Long Island University for 30 years, and Cliff DuRand taught philosophy at Morgan State University for 40 years. He's given many talks in our Snowbird Symposium and our Global Justice Report, and he has also edited 2 volumes of essays presented at 2 of the conferences that we've had. Bob Stone has written many articles on the French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, many co-authored with me. And we will be publishing our book on Sartre's Second Ethics in April of this year. Both Bob and Cliff have been activists in the civil rights movement since the 60s. I was a little young for that. So I'm very pleased, given the context that we are now living in the United States of these terrible police murders and mass shootings, to think back to a time, the 60s, during the civil rights movement, when we were young and full of hope, and we were sure that we could change the world and make it a better place. And for a while, it really did seem that we were successful. So things don't look as hopeful today. But thank you very much for coming. So Cliff will speak first for about 20, 30 minutes, and then Bob will speak.
Yes, this is an anniversary occasion because it was on February 1st, 1960, that the Black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat in at a Woolworths counter, and that sparked similar demonstrations across the country, rejuvenating the civil rights movement that actually had been in existence for some time. But the 1960s was opened with that event. At the time, I was a undergraduate student at the University of North Dakota, majoring in philosophy. And I remember a fellow philosophy major saying, well, we should go downtown and picket the Woolworths here in Grand Forks. And I thought, why would I want to do that? Walk up and down the sidewalk, making a fool of myself? Didn't see the point of it. I had been a product of the 1950s, a very apolitical era. After graduating, I moved to Baltimore to do graduate work at Johns Hopkins University. And there, for the first time, I was confronted with the realities of racism in US society. I had been unaware of it in North Dakota. I mean, the only Black people I saw were porters on the Pullman trains that came through town. There were no Blacks in North Dakota at that time. Later, there were 2 Air Force bases built, and that changed the racial complexion of the state. But at the time, I was oblivious to those, to the plight of African Americans. But once I was in Baltimore, I rather quickly found myself being swept up in the demonstrations against the segregated restaurants in Baltimore. And I remember I picketed on many Saturdays, but I remember the first time that I joined a sit-in. A group of us, a mixed group, went into the Hooper's restaurant on 32nd Street and Greenmount Avenue. And when they asked us to leave because they did not serve Blacks, we refused to leave. They called the police, and when the police arrived, the owner then had to read the trespass ordinance, because that was the law that enabled exclusion of Blacks from the restaurant. Now, we had not intended to be arrested, and so once that had been read and the proprietor asked us to leave, we did get up and left the restaurant and joined the picket line out front. But I remember to this day the feeling of outrage that I had when, for the first time, I had experienced the discrimination that Blacks had long had to suffer. And it was that moment, it was kind of a conversion experience. It was that moment that made me an activist. I went on to demonstrate, to march, not only in Baltimore, but also on the eastern shore of Maryland, which we called, Little Georgia. Very racist. There were, I remember in Cambridge, there was seeing pickup trucks with rifle racks, circling our demonstrations. We knew that it was a dangerous place. Gloria Richardson, who recently died, was the leader of that those demonstrations in Cambridge. Only a couple times did I come close to being the victim of racist violence. I was in a march protesting a segregated swimming pool in South Baltimore, and someone threw a brick at me, but it missed and hit someone else. So that was a close call. He wasn't seriously injured, taken to the hospital, but he was okay. And then there was another time when, after demonstrations, we gathered for a party. And when I left the party, got in my car, a brick was thrown, breaking the window of the car. I went inside, and Stokely Carmichael, who was in most of these demonstrations, Stokely Carmichael gave an impassioned speech saying that he was going to press charges against the police who had been rather brutal toward us that day. And that kind of stretched our understanding of nonviolence, because we thought nonviolence meant that you just take the blows and suffer and don't retaliate. But to retaliate by taking legal action seemed like, more than what Martin Luther King had been advocating. Of course, we didn't have to worry about those who were arrested, because a black judge heard the case and dismissed all of the charges first thing the next morning. But I remember Stokely well, because he was dating a Morgan student who rented a room from us. And so he would often come and visit her, and go out on dates. I last saw Stokely, Kwame Ture, as he came to call himself later, in Havana at a conference where he had just been diagnosed with cancer. And he said, yeah, the big C finally got me, the CIA. And that was the last I saw of Stokely. There were others who were involved in the civil rights movement that I remember well. When I started teaching at historically Black Morgan State University, I was asked to be the faculty advisor for a student group called Dissent. And well, in those days, there were demonstrations going on at many universities across the country. Although Morgan wasn't segregated, there was a requirement that all freshmen and sophomore males take ROTC. And the students, mounted a protest against that, even sitting down to block a major intersection during rush hour adjacent to campus. After that, the president called me in and asked me if I thought it was appropriate to, be protesting the policies of the university that employed me. And I said, well, why not? It's a free country, isn't it? And I think he respected me for that, because he did go on to give me tenure as well as promotions. I found teaching at a Black university a particularly rewarding experience, because I felt a part of a people's ongoing struggle, a part of their history, Um, and, uh, and though I'd had the opportunity to change to teach at a white institution, as many of my fellow graduate students did do, where they were able to climb the academic ladder. I preferred to stay at Morgan, taught there for 40 years until I finally retired. And I found that the most rewarding experience of my life. So in conclusion, the point I want to make is that the 60s, the civil rights movement, and particularly those of us who participated in that and the other movements, the anti-war movement, for example, found that it transformed our lives, as indeed it did transform mine. I have been an activist for social justice ever since. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cliff. Our next speaker is Bob Stone, who was involved in the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964 in Macomb, is it Mississippi or Alabama? Can't remember which. And at the time, I was only 10 years old, but at the time, everyone in the country knew that Northern activists were going to be coming to the Black Belt of the South to help register Black people to vote. And people thought at the time that the simple fact of registering to vote would provide some kind of greater racial equality. I think we've come to reflect on that since then, that goal. But Bob, if you would please come tell your story about how you got from New York City to a civil rights activist.
My title is Remembering and Using Mississippi Freedom Summer. I'm going to read it to keep under the time allotted to me, which is how many minutes?
20 or 30.
Okay, here we go. My dad was from Arkansas, and my mom was from Alabama. But I was born in New York City in 1938 and raised as a Yankee. How then did I get back to the South as a civil rights activist from these two wannabe Yankees who admired that culture? With my white skin and Northern accent. Arriving in '64 at Mississippi Freedom Summer. That story might help us grasp some aspects of our situation, but I'm going to plunge into it. Part of the explanation must be Etta Raines Hairston of Eden in northern North Carolina on the Virginia line. To this day, thanks to Etta's cooking, my favorite foods are Southern, including greens with fatback and grits. My dad, an architect, had been ordered to Washington to design Air Force bases. So we moved there in 1940. As my 4th birthday drew near in the late summer of '42, my mom introduced me to Etta as my nurse since my mom was already trying to retain her wandering husband's interest in her, this was an ambiguous event for me. On Etta's arrival, I literally fell into a series of accidents, hospitalized in one case for concussion after falling onto concrete when a gate I walked on opened. I learned in therapy much later that the accidents were meant to raise my mother's distracted interest in me. In visits with Etta to parks, however, talking trash over a greasy stove, seated on my tall architect's stool as I watched her cook, and listened with her to Duke Ellington and Joe Louis fights on the radio, I bathed in her love. The accidents stopped. A lot more to that story, but I'm not going to stop there. 22 years later, arriving in Greenville, Mississippi, straight from Texas, where I'd gone to start a PhD in philosophy, my first stop as a prospective civil rights volunteer was at the home of Harding Carter III, an obscure name you may or may not remember. Editor, like his father, of the Greenville Daily Paper in Mississippi Delta, Western Mississippi. He later did PR for Jimmy Carter's State Department, you may recall. Harding, 6 years my elder, eagerly asked what the invasion of over 700 mostly white strangers trained in nonviolence really wanted from Mississippi. I laid out our Freedom Summer project derived from Southern political geography. I told him our goal was to register the prospective majority of Black voters in its Black belt in the Black Belt of the South. That is, the majority Black counties from Texas to Virginia, so that a truly free voice might finally be heard from the South. Surprised that we wanted only to register voters, he exclaimed with relief that he had thought we aimed to redistribute land. Had he feared we'd try to make good on General Sherman's post-Civil War hope that Black families receive 40 acres and a mule? As a freedom school teacher, I was first sent to Hattiesburg. It was night. I could also drop off there my hefty 8-cylinder Buick Special land yacht, which I had given to the movement. Stokely Carmichael, a SNCC leader who later took the name Kwame Ture, on joining the Black Panther Party, he was both head of SNCC and Black Panthers, was also headed for SNCC is
Southern Nonviolent
Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, their safe house in Hattiesburg, big town, much bigger than Greenville. He wanted a ride on condition that he drive. A movement person had been shot in the back of the head with a shotgun from a pickup. His strategy was to set the Buick on 70 and go up to 100 if anyone stayed with us in the rearview mirror. Also on board was fellow Texan Bruce Maxwell, whose self-imposed summer mission was to help white farmers resist visiting Klan policing the color line by forbidding interracial play among kids. Stokely driving, lofting and bouncing down this two-lane road very fast with an elbow out the window and no seatbelt in those days, lectured us on the fierce independence of Mississippi's Black farmers. Passing through Indianola on the way to Hattiesburg, which was Mississippi headquarters for the White Citizens Councils, sort of a classy version of the Klan, asked us to get on the floor of our integrated car. Reaching Hattiesburg, the Curtin Safe House was a huge black block in the African-American neighborhood. Inside was all double-decker bunks under fluorescence. Having delivered the car, Bruce and I hitched north separately for nonviolence training at Miami Wesleyan University in Ohio. Word was out internationally. White US youth were putting their skin on the voter registration game. Still in Mississippi, waking up on church pews to which police had shown me, I hit the road early. A postman setting out on his route picked me up. It was his own car. He started right away. Segregation is all I've known, he said. We were raised with it. It's our deepest habit. We don't know anything else. Listening to this, I took my breath away. I didn't know what to say. He had said it all. He hoped I knew where to go. There had to be a better way. We both knew that. But how do we enact it? Neither of us knew. There had to be a lot of silence between us, and there was. I said that a lot of people felt the way he did, and that was okay. Do we have to know already precisely where we are going before we can even set out? I never got over that moment. It is the same moment today. I'll get to that in a minute. We face nuclear war. We know there's a human way to avoid it. Where is it? Which path leads to it? We don't know. We have to act on incomplete knowledge. Reaching Miami Wesleyan, I threw myself into the collective preparation. Bob Moses' calm struck me. His leadership was unlike Martin Luther King Jr.'s. He was no orator. He had invented Freedom Summer, and he oversaw our training. When Black Mississippians tried to register to vote, their names were taken and circulated, and many of them were fired from jobs. Literacy tests and toll taxes didn't work. This worked. Firing people. Folks gave up trying to register. Mississippi was a closed society. Everyone knew each other, and they knew where the power was. It was skin color. Bob saw it had to be broken open. Knowing the risk we white kids took, he was full of respect for us. A first cohort was sent down before the majority of us. And then that was on June 21, news came back to Ohio. The three volunteers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, had disappeared after being released from jail on the 29th of the 21st of June. Out on the elevated stage the next day, Bob told us the whole truth right away. According to SNCC's experience of disappearances in Mississippi after release from jail, they all pointed directly to presuming the three were already dead. We learned 44 days later that they were. They got the FBI on it reluctantly. Hoover didn't want to do it. Nobody, Bob then emphasized, would blame any volunteer who resigned from Freedom Summer. I've since learned just recently that a few did resign. But at the time, it seemed to everyone I talked with that none had. I'm convinced in any case that June 22, when he told us what we knew might happen, and we were all there despite that risk, when we stayed, knowing that we would risk following them into death, that was our moment of victory. To stop us, all the Klan had was terror. Murdering Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner did not stop us. Their nuclear bomb had not worked, and they had nothing bigger. What was the conclusion? Even knowing they risked death by going to Mississippi, the vast majority of over 700 volunteers, led by COFO. COFO was Council of Federated Organizations, CORE, SNCC, NAACP, SCLC was in it, but NAACP was the legal thing. They didn't do that. In short, all Klan conditioning of us, and that was a plan, this discouragement for us to contemplate up there in Ohio, had failed. At that moment, the morning of June 22, 1964 to be exact, Mississippi Freedom Summer won. This victory had effects. I'm convinced that passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 were direct results. Okay, that's up to now. I want to thank two people. First, I thank Cliff DuRand for showing me recently in this forum that race is not only a social construct, but a choice. Quoting him, "Which side are you on?" he asked. There is little moral value in being white. A lot of people choose to be white. That's a hefty choice. There's considerable moral value, says Cliff, in being black. There's the most in being human. Close quote. I want to thank Etta Harrison again for helping me choose to be human. But the choice to be human today is, how am I doing for time?
You're fine.
Choice to be human today is much harder and more complex than it was in 60. In 1964, we won, I've said. But as of 2023, we must acknowledge that today, we who worked in Mississippi Freedom Summer also lost. The guts have been cut out of the 65 Voting Rights Act. You can't hold up the history of a state in order to measure it against its current doings. more broadly, instead of giving up white supremacy as we hoped they would, Southern Democrats just switched parties. The effect was to expose the Yankee racism hiding in Yankee capitalism, personified by Donald Trump and former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani. After the 5 suspects' acquittal in the Central Park jogger case, Donald Trump signaled he would happily lead a Southernized U.S., that is to say, an openly racist U.S., when he continued to demand the death penalty for the 5 wrongly accused suspects. They're black. That's all. All he then had to do was profess an evangelical religion, which he must have laughed at up to then, and leadership of a Southernized U.S. was for many his for the taking. But choosing humanity today means slowing the death train we are on aimed at nuclear winter and omnicide. To do this, the world must back off of Biden's escalation of the Russia-Ukraine conflict with his tank shipments. For this task, we must take care to avoid the danger of white savior hubris. The hubris expressed in the statue, thankfully removed from the front of the Museum of Natural History, showing Teddy Roosevelt on a horse with a black African on one side and an American Indian on the other side, leading them into liberation. Odious, embarrassing image. But that is a danger also in misusing and not learning from Mississippi Freedom Summer. It was a ground in which this savior complex, white savior complex, might flourish, which still haunts us. This new film, Avatar, is a case of white savior. Give it up. The initiative for freedom nowadays is going to come from places like Mexico. We must get to know humanity and foster its flourishing in all its variety and possibilities. Our perspectives, starting from the pinnacle of power from which we are now installed, leading the world, it's going to take a lot of reflection and thought and time. Thank you.
I would like to invite anyone else who was involved as directly in the civil rights movement who wants to share with us some of their own reflections. Yes, please. Yeah, why don't you come up here so you'll be recorded?
Okay, my name is Bill Krajak. I was born and raised in a southern Illinois town, and I don't remember seeing a black person for the first 18 years of my life. When Martin Luther King organized a march on Montgomery, the second one, the first one was stopped by the local police. The second one was guarded by the National Guard and under the federal government. So I thought it was safe enough, and at the time I was in law school, I did not watch TV. I did not listen to radio. A friend of mine says, I'm going down to Selma, Alabama, and I need a car. Would you loan me yours? And I says, no, but I'll drive. So I went down, we drove 18 hours to get there from the University of Illinois. We spent 12 hours there and then drove 18 hours back. We marched for, I don't know, about 10 hours. And Selma, Alabama was an Air Force base down there. And I was able to see Martin Luther King give a talk in front of Brown's Chapel. Then we marched for 8 hours or 8 miles. And we had to stop because the interstate 4-lane section stopped 8 miles out of town. And most of us came back and went on home. And after I went home, I talked to my mother and told her what I had done. And that's the last I heard about the march from my family. I tried talking to them and nobody said a thing. And then one year, maybe 10, 15 years later, somebody was talking about about racism, and my cousin says, hey, wait a minute, Bill there worked for civil rights, and what are you doing talking about it? And I was stunned. My whole family knew about my travels, and they wouldn't talk to me about it. I still haven't talked to them about it. I tried to. And after I got back from that, I found out that a woman from Michigan named Violet Liuzzo was murdered when she was driving people back and forth to get to their cars so that they could leave town. And after that, the next year, I went out to the Democratic primary in Eureka, Alabama. It was a county with 80% Black citizens. And they were finally all registered to vote. So we figured there wouldn't be any problem electing Black candidates. But they didn't get elected. There was there were 5 Black candidates, and one of them was elected. And we found out that he was elected because he was running for dog catcher. He was the absolute last person on the ballot. So after that, I joined the Air Force. And I wasn't able to participate anymore. And they questioned the voters and asked them, why didn't you vote for all 5 of the Black candidates? This is, we didn't know who they were. They were illiterate. They'd gone to school, and once they come home from school, there was nothing to read in their houses. So their ability to read was degraded by the fact that they weren't reading anything at all after school. The 5 Black candidates were ministers and school teachers. And they were the only Black people that were literate in that county. So, and I'd like to tell you about the incident where At one time, I had the only car running in the entire campaign. So I had to take this one candidate home. He lived out in the country, and across the road from him was a roadhouse, a bar out in the country. And after I dropped him off and headed on back to, was it Eureka? 12 people came out of the bar, got into 2 cars, and came out after me. I'm still alive. Why am I still alive? Because those folks were so drunk that they took out after me and missed the driveway. They were stuck in the ditch. Here I am. It's wonderful. And that's my story.
Does anyone else have a story that they would like to share with us? Or would you like to share some more of your stories, Bob? I remember the story you shared with me that you there were a bunch of you staying together in one home, a bunch of the volunteers from the north. And one of them happened to be this kid from New York City who is going to school in UC Berkeley, and his name was Mario Savio. And after the Freedom Summer of '64, he went back to UC Berkeley and started the free speech movement. And that's a story that Bob didn't tell, but Mario Savio was also involved with them at the time. Yeah?
Yeah, I got some more stories if you like.
Does anybody else want to, Arturo, I know you have something to say, and then we'll come back to you, Phil. Go ahead, Arturo. Yeah, come on.
There are many points and lines that I would like to develop from both of you and yours. But giving a brief biography, I just say that unlike many of you, I arrived in Texas, 1960, just about as ignorant as any other white kid from ghetto Brooklyn. My education really started in Texas, but to catapult it, in 1966, I returned to Texas after 4 years on GI Bill to go to the University of Texas at Odessa, which was at that time a junior college. I was being educated in Texas about racism indirectly. I lived fully in the white community, occasionally slipping out to the Cotton Club in Middleton, Texas, where we got to see the great Black musicians, singers, magnificent experiences, always being slightly educated step by step about my own racism, unknown racism. However, when I got to Texas Tech, my education exploded. And it exploded in an environment which was really very unusual. And to summarize that, I just say that without boasting, I was catapulted because of my big mouth to the leadership of what was called then the Student Action Committee. It was basically an anarchist group where I was accused of being a Marxist. I didn't even know what Marxism was in 1960. A measure of my ignorance. However, through that process, I learned what the potential for our future may be. Keying off Bob's point of, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, but we are in the pit of the moment of massive destruction. And what do we do? Well, with the brief reflection on that moment, 1966, 1968 in Texas, as I have to admit, a poorly informed leader of then the Student Action Committee, I was elected by 27% of the vote for president of the student body in Texas by white kids who in Lubbock, Texas, West Texas, were with people in Austin in the avant-garde of what was becoming a student activist movement in conjunction with the few Black and Mexican Americans, students, and our neighbors in the community. So all that to say, for those of you who have the Ann Braden reflection that I distributed as you came in, we should be asking, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? And perhaps one of the stimuli of Bob and Cliff's presentation is to ask ourselves at our advanced stage, what have we done wrong? And how we can use that dialectically to begin to do things better as we are tripping or being dragged into the pit. To the lawyers, thank you very much. You saved my ass when I was in Texas. Thank you. I would like to provoke that discussion on from everyone. What must we do?
What is to be done? As Lenin famously said. What is to be done, as Lenin famously said. Other comments? I was hoping to rekindle some of the spirit of the 60s and the Liz, okay, and the hope and the joy that we felt then. Liz, your turn.
Okay, I'll just make a couple brief comments. In 1959, I started college in Auburn, Alabama. Okay, this is a few years before the Freedom Summer, but my remarks are prompted from Bob's remark of meeting someone who said, this is all we've ever known. And so when I arrived at Auburn, that was a state school. In the first quarter I was there, there was a kind of fluffle that took place where the college, the editor of the college newspaper, her name was Ann Rivers, wrote an editorial that was along the lines of maybe down the road somewhere we should begin to consider integration here in Auburn. And she was fired by the state authorities for that position. All of us students were, or all of my friends, we were just in shock. Because the lesson we got from that was society is an immovable object. We may not like things, they may be terrible, they may be unjust, they may be undemocratic, but there's nothing we can do. And it wasn't, this editor went on to become a novelist. And she wrote a novel on that incident called Heartbreak Hotel. And it later became a movie. I mean, I had gone on to get out of school, moved to New York and had come into the anti-war movement where it began to dawn on it for the first time, had the idea that yes, change is possible. But anyway, what my college roommate from that time, maybe 10, 15 years later, when the movie came out, called me and said, Liz, it's our story, because it impacted a lot of us. But in terms of what is to be done, I think we have to be aware of where people are all over the place. And the idea that change is possible is not necessarily, something has to happen for you to believe that. So anyway, that was my thought. Yes.
Let me just add to that, Liz, you joggled my memory. When I was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University, there was a group of us who did a report, a study, and an accusation against the university because there were no Blacks among the student body. There was one Black who worked in the bookstore, and that was about the only presence on campus that I saw. So that when we released that report, we circulated a petition. I remember taking it to my department chair, Maurice Mandelbaum, and he refused to sign it. For him, the status quo was fine. One other story that came to mind was, what we were asking for, what we were demanding in the civil rights movement was that Blacks be given, equal opportunity. And I remember years later being visited by Claudia Rawls, who had been a student of mine at Morgan. After she graduated, she took a position with the State Department, focusing on African affairs. And I said, well, that's okay, good, congratulations. But then years later, she visited me with a friend of hers. And as she left, she handed me her card. She was now on assignment working with Colin Powell. And I thought, gee, I guess that was what we were really struggling for, to have equal access to positions of authority in society. But I felt kind of sorry that she had gone in that direction. If there's anyone watching on YouTube who would like to send a question or comment, you can do so by sending an email to me, and I'll check my email and pass that question or comment on to the rest of us.
Lynn, I'd like that. I'd like to ask you a question.
Please come up here.
The last narrative with Colin Powell. What is one of the fundamental lessons we who remain in the movement should learn from that experience? Because it's not only in that moment, hundreds of thousands of others and a long history that precedes it.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, well, the lesson was that the civil rights movement was not radical enough. It didn't ask to change society, but just for blacks to become a part of the society. And the racism that we still see today is because there were not fundamental changes made.
Can I
I
add
see
something?
Bob is moved to speak.
Yeah. I just wanted to thank you for your comments and tell a little bit of a denouement. Age 10, my mother complained to me that I was hugging and kissing Etta too much. And that she was black, and that was the end of the story. We were driving under the 3rd Avenue L, and I remember the dappled sunlight. And I had the sense not to defy her, but I knew who my mom was. And I shut up because I knew age 10 that the dynamics of the household were such that if I defended Etta and my relation to her, I might lose her. And on the matter of winning and losing, just another denouement of my little meeting with Hotting Carter. What happened there was he was right. Voting is not enough. Land distribution or the like is required. And I'm very happy to say that Betsy's and my work with GEO, which a group we worked with, grassroots economic organizing, was the shelter in which Jessica Gordon Nembhard felt stimulated to write Collective Courage, which is a history of the use of workplace democracy, worker cooperatives for self-service to the Black community, going way back to the slavery times even. And that book has, and GEO in general, has focused on the use of worker cooperatives as a form for serving the Black community. And so one way or another, there has been a little chipping away at Sherman's promise. If that promise had been fulfilled, we would be living in a very different country, or we might.
I'm reminded that when I was growing up in North Dakota, as I mentioned, there were no blacks in the state. But one of my favorite playmates in high school had a slightly darker complexion. And my mother became upset about the fact that I was hanging out with him and forbade me because, he's a criminal. That kind of racism really runs deep, and people often don't even recognize it.
Are there other comments or reflections? Daniel, please. This is a time for reflecting on the violence in our society and the racism in our society. So please feel free to.
Thank you, Cliff and Bob. So I just wanted to, from my perspective, I'd say, yes, great strides have been made over time, but there's at the same time, there's still clearly very deep racism in the world and in the US. Just to sort of reiterate Arturo's question, so I'd like to know if you have any ideas, or the audience, about what tactics for the current situation, because there's been a resurgence in fighting against racism with the Black Lives Matter movement and so on. What tactics do you see that you think are useful and should be continued with more vigor? What tactics maybe do you think are not helpful? And what tactics do you think would be useful to be incorporated to make things move forward at more than a snail's pace? This has been going on for a long time. There's still, again, profound racism in the US. Is there something we can do? Is there some kind of, again, new tactic that can be employed to change the dynamic? Thank you.
One thing that can be done on the individual level, I can illustrate by a story from my wife. Julie lived in a white suburb of Washington, D.C. And one day her son had gone down to the laundry room and came back very disturbed, saying, "I saw a Black man there." As if he had never seen one before, but it was threatening. And so what Julie did was she took a year off and took the kids to Barbados. Well, that's one way of overcoming racism, exposure to people of color, where you can learn that they're just ordinary people like you and me. Nothing threatening there. But of course, that's only a solution on the individual level. More fundamentally, really, there has to be changes in policy and in social structure to overcome racism. Well, one of the good things about the integration of schools was that it made it possible for Black and white children to mingle together and get to know one another. I know my daughters went to integrated school in Baltimore, and as a result of that, they had Black playmates, and thus avoided the kind of racism on the individual level that was so common otherwise. But beyond that, that's an example of where a policy change did change the life experiences of individuals. But beyond that, more fundamental change needs to be done. And we're a long way from doing that.
Anyone else? Arturo, please come forward.
Thanks for giving me another opening, Cliff. It's on the individual level. As a union delegate for the UFT, for the United Federation of Teachers for 25 years, I'd like to relate a story which I think everyone can appreciate. There are many levels in which we can come to know our neighbors, but let me just relate one story to you. Before a union meeting in the late afternoon in the school building, a few of my colleagues, interracial, Hispanic, Haitians, mixed race people, and whites, we were planning quickly to set and fix the agenda. We went into the cafeteria where almost the entire faculty was assembled, having a late lunch. That was the plan. I walked in with my colleague Jean Laventure, who from Haiti with a long history with W.E. Du Bois. So this is a very conscious Black Haitian. No mulatto, not high yellow, Black. And we walk in to the room and, oh, I forgot to preface. We were working in all Black high school, almost all Black. I mean, all 5 white kids were not counted, but nearly 100% Black and mixed race. And the faculty was mixed. And we walk into the cafeteria, and almost 90% of the Black teachers and Hispanic teachers are divided, and the white teachers are on the other side of the room. And John and I, we looked at each other and said, let's fix it. And without criticizing, indicting anyone, we had very good relations with our staff, and we asked everybody just to look at their neighbor, who they were sitting with. And we said, what's wrong here? Jean and I spontaneously played it off as if it was scripted. And the teachers looked at each other and they got it. Friends, neighbors who went out to dinner together. We did not have any measure of open racism. Probably there was some unconscious racist, but the teachers looked at each other and with a measure of embarrassment, they just got up and took their plates, as you might, and mingled and sat down together, and then we had the meeting started. So, as we have many problems to face, but once again, what can we do individually? As former teachers, former lawyers, former corporate executives, some of you, I don't know, but what can we do in our everyday life, especially at this age, to create a new society, a new consciousness through behaviors or correcting our own behaviors? Thank you again. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Arturo. Please, please.
So, I'm Canadian, and the civil rights movement was a bit distant for us. But I think you said something, Cliff, that really struck me. I'm involved at home with the Indigenous rights movement, and I was watching we were watching a video with Angela Davis the other day, and she was talking about the civil rights movement and her role and her sister's role. And something came up about, we're only kind of scratching the surface. We haven't gone deep enough into it to make the real change that needs to happen. And we didn't we didn't go far enough, and we haven't gone far enough, and we're continue to not go far enough. We don't continue to go deeper into this. And I was thinking about that. I was thinking about the Black Panther movement, and maybe you guys could comment on the role of the more organized illegal actions of the civil rights movement versus how the Black Panthers reacted to it.
Well, I can't speak to that, but maybe one of you two could. The nonviolent civil disobedience seems to me the only way to go forward today, given the strength of the repressive apparatus that exists and the state of surveillance that we are all under. But Bob, would you like to say something?
Yeah, a little bit. Yes, Stokely was a leader in SNCC, in the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee leadership. And then he moved to the Black Panther Party, where he was also a leader, changed his name. It was not a big deal for us. We were used, at least in Mississippi, we were used to Black leadership in all of the freedom houses. And that was normal. So Black Power was a goal of ours. And we were reminded if we didn't accept that. And on the matter of violence, we had cases where participants in the movement had to defend themselves. I was sent from Hattiesburg to Macomb by Staunton Lynn, who was the head of the Freedom School arm. There were Freedom School, voter registration, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. I forget the fourth arm of COFO. We had to decide, do we want to have someone in the house with that man who was ready with his weapon to shoot anyone who came by to bomb him? Because people would throw these bombs, they'd leave a crater in the lawn, and you couldn't tell a family not to defend themselves. Those were trials and tribulations. We were not, we didn't resolve that. I think we were solidarizing with families that had a member defending the home, but we were not absolutist about it. I had one incident when I was attacked. I took my tire of my car downtown to get it in Macomb. Macomb was a terrible town. It's right above New Orleans, in that part of Mississippi that's above New Orleans. And the Klan was very strong, and they had come by several times and shot 30 bullets through the garage where people slept. And so one of our leaders got his foot shot up. Real bad actors there, but we knew that we couldn't do but we couldn't have weapons. it would be a death sentence for us. Just by, and what I did when I was attacked, I was rolling my tire across back to my car. And this guy, I didn't realize it was just one person, got me from behind, threw me down, and started kicking me. I went into my fetal pose to defend myself, and then I realized it was only one person. So I got up and I looked him in the eye and I said, "Stop hitting me." Well, that shifted, from actions to words. It was a whole, he didn't know what to do. What do you say to this bad, evil civil rights invader? So he just walked away. And so I got my tire and I went, finished putting it in the car and drove away. But that change of language from action to words did amazing things. And it worked out. It was just the right thing, and all of our training was paid off.
Any other comment? Roberto?
Yes, well, I would like to know, you're very experienced people in the 60s and the 70s. And for me, it's a mystery that you haven't talked of anything about the Vietnam War that took place in the 60s. And I'd like to know what were the basis for this decision. Unbelievable that the United States took against a tiny country very far away with nothing to do with the United States.
Well, of course, the civil rights movement led directly into the anti-war movement in the 60s. And it was not known at the time that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was staged to provoke the United States to enter the war against North Vietnam. And I think that in the forever wars that have gone on since Vietnam and that are continuing, the profits of the weapons manufacturers are so irresistible that a war is kept going year after year after year, because the US economy, US capitalism depends upon the war economy. And that's something that we didn't, even though Eisenhower had warned the whole country in his farewell address, that's something that we didn't see in the anti-war movement. We saw this silly idea of dominoes. At first, South Vietnam would fall and then other countries would fall. But we were supporting self-determination at the time, and self-determination for colonized countries in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East. But I think today we've been speaking about the earlier part of the 60s, which was the beginning of the civil rights movement rather than the anti-war movement, although they sort of just moved from one to the other. Cliff, Bob, would you like to add something?
Yes, thank you. You're absolutely right. We were very much involved in the anti-war struggle. And it was also a racial struggle. Geeks, slant, the whole racist vocabulary sprang up again. around that war. And overrode the moral hesitation of wiping out a tiny little country. The momentum of US racism was pretty deep, and I think was important in keeping that war starting and keeping it going. What would you say, Glenn?
The civil rights movement was kind of the spark that started a prairie fire. Because the spirit of activism that it generated spread throughout the society. And it fueled the anti-war movement. It fueled the feminist movement. One movement led to another as people woke up and discovered that their personal troubles were public problems, public issues that needed to be addressed collectively.
Surely there's more experience here to share.
Please, come forward. No, it's hard to talk with these minutes.
It is hard to talk with the masks on. My name is Brian McDougall. I'm also Canadian and a little bit younger than most of the speakers, so I can't speak to events in the 60s. But I did want to make the point that oftentimes when we're looking at and thinking about the left internationally, we think obviously about the tremendous influence of the war in Vietnam and how that sparked and encouraged student movements and other kinds of radical movements in Western Europe, other parts of the world, and so on, and certainly in Canada. But I wanted to make the point that even the events that were being discussed today, the Freedom Summer events in the mid-60s and so on, also had a major impact in other countries. So I know in Canada, I live in the nation's capital, Ottawa. I know that in Ottawa in 1964, 1965, 1966, there were major demonstrations by students in solidarity with what was going on in the United States. So when sorry?
Canada also accepted all those wonderful draft voters.
Yeah, that came later, but the point I'm making is that when we try to understand the ups and downs of the left, the ups and downs of social movements, the importance of international examples can never be forgotten. So, and we've been reminded of that again very recently. Look at the impact that Black Lives Matter has had internationally. Look at the impact that, a decade ago, the uprisings in the Middle East had throughout the world. So we should never lose sight of the fact that even when we're talking about what appears to be domestic events driven by the local peculiarities of capitalism in the United States and its history with slavery, that those events have an international impact. And so when we think about the prospects for the future, we have to remember that even as, predominantly North Americans, we might get a little bit disgusted or demoralized by the failures of the left in our own countries and so on. We should never lose sight of the fact that by keeping our eyes on the broader world, we can see that there's tremendous potential for inspiration from the struggles of others. Thanks.
Thank you.
The protest movements of the 60s in the United States reached their crescendo in 1968. But 68 was a year that there were worldwide protests as well. Here in Mexico, major demonstrations. And as a result of the repression of those, we ended up with the Zapatista movement. In France, there was the May-June '68 demonstrations. There were 68, the Cultural Revolution erupted in China. So there's kind of a contagion of activism that spread around the globe.
It coincided, by the way, with the practice of live feeds on TV. You could see demonstrations fomented in Pakistan, Turkey.
Yeah, technology had played a large role in
Spreading the
spreading,
phenomenon.
yeah. Yeah, okay, just a short comment, Arturo, and then I think we should. Yeah.
I'd like to direct my comments to you, Ricardo, because in North America, Mexico included, we face an enormous class problem. And the ruling class plays on that problem by recruiting some of the most desperate people. We know very well that the United States is currently recruiting other Central American, Mexican American people to fight in their imperialist wars. It's called, as many of you probably know, economic recruitment or the economic draft. Our educational responsibilities are huge in this class struggle because the ruling class has the power to recruit workers to work for starvation wages or to recruit workers who are dependent to fight in the US imperialist wars, whether they are in Central America, which many of us know well, or currently in other parts of the world with unfulfilled promises. So let's take that into account as part of our responsibilities. Currently, there's a push in the United States to include young people at the high school level in ROTC. I could use some derogatory names for ROTC, but it's recruitment for murder of other people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Arturo. Well, thank you all. Thank you very much. And I want to thank our program committee, Liz Mestres, Roberto Robles, Bob Stone, Cliff DuRand, myself, Gregory Diamond, who's also on the program committee for making these events possible. Thursday will be followed up by a movie at 11:30 on Cuba and music. And next Monday will be Camila Piñeros Harnacker, who will be speaking on co-ops in Cuba. So I look forward to seeing you guys again. And thank you very much for coming today.